Okay, welcome. Today I want to answer the question and ask the question, is boarding school child abuse? I'm going to look at some of the work of Joy Schaverien. I'm also going to quote from some of the books of Bear Grylls and Eddie Izzard, who both went to boarding school, and I'm going to quote some of the work of the NSPCC as well. And yeah, just let's ask this question, is boarding school child abuse? So I'm going to begin by reading out a journal paper called Boarding School, The Trauma of the Privileged Child, from the Journal of Analytical Psychology in 2004. This is Joy Schaverien. She says, a Dutch colleague who had been a hidden child in the Netherlands during the Second World War worked with child survivors of the Japanese prison camps. These experiences led her to the observation that the British establishment was a group of traumatized people as a result of the practice of sending young children away from home to be placed in the care of strangers. She was amazed that this was not because of some dire political situation, but for the purposes of education. This, alongside the experiences of my patients, led me to consider the British boarding school system to be a particularly British form of child abuse. So that's very powerful words from Joy Schaverien, and that was nearly 20 years ago. So the first thing to really talk about is, is boarding school child abuse, is the difference between past and present. I'll first of all look at past, and then towards the end of today I'll talk about the present. The first thing to just note, most people say, well, child abuse is sexual abuse. So no, what we're looking at is just the whole encompassing area of boarding school. Is just the fact of separating the child, putting them in an institution, a loveless institution, as George Monbiot said. Is that child abuse? And I'm just going to look. What does the NSPCC talk about neglect? So, yeah, essentially, the NSPCC on their website, they talk about neglect. And neglect is the ongoing failure to meet a child's basic needs. And I'll finish that quote off in a bit. But they go that a child might be left dirty, hungry, or without proper clothing, supervision, shelter, or health care. This can put a child or young person in danger. Yeah. So let us have a look. Neglect. They call neglect, put it into 4 different areas at NSPCC. They call it physical neglect, emotional neglect. They also say about educational neglect and healthcare neglect. And as I kind of look through the definitions of it, I'll read some of the books, but I'm aware that for me, boarding school is both a physical neglect, or certainly it has been in the past. We were often physically, it wasn't safe a lot of the time. There was a lot of bullying which went on. And then emotionally, we didn't have the care. Again, as Joy Schaverien says, she says, the lack of appropriate physical contact for an extended period of time in boarding schools is a serious deprivation. Yeah, there's no touch. It's called skin hunger. A child needs to be touched and held. So so that's kind of looking at that. And then so for me, boarding school is both a physical neglect, it has been, and emotional neglect. Okay, so continuing the statement from the NSPCC, it says, neglect is the ongoing failure to meet a child's basic needs and the most common form of child abuse. So let's have a look at let's read David Cameron from his book For the Record. He says, the food was Spartan. I lost a stone in weight during a single term. That there was one meal that consisted of curry, rice and maggots. Okay, that's interesting. I lost a stone in weight. So he was 7, 8, 9. I'm not entirely sure how old he was, and I'd have to kind of read through his book. This was just from an article, and I'll put the article in the description below. But let's get an idea that the average weight of a 7-year-old when he went to boarding school is 3 stone 8 pounds. 8-year-old is 4 stone. A 9-year-old is 4 stone 7 pounds. Okay, and I think it goes up. 11-year-old possibly goes up to about 5 stone. So if he lost a stone in weight, that would take him down to 2 stone as a 7-year-old, 2 stone 8. As a 8-year-old, that's a quarter of his body weight. If you think of a fully grown man, might be 12 stone, you lose a quarter of your body weight, that takes you down to 9 stone. Or if you're a 10 stone man, that would take you down to 7.5 stone, 7 stone. For me, again, this is just me reading this, that for me is neglect. And then I read Eddie Izzard from his book. He went to board at age 6, just after his mother had died. And he says in here, the food was awful, and I had a real food problem, a real basic palate. So he went age 6, and I think there's a photo of him here. I think that is age 6. Yeah, that's how old he was when he went. And page 27 in the book, he says, Eddie Izzard is thinking about boarding school. I think I've wiped out some of the more bad experiences from that time. So, kind of spoke last week about dissociation. And then Bear Grylls in his book, Mud, Sweat and Tears, says, I meet lots of folk nowadays who say how great boarding school is as a way of toughening kids up. That feels a bit back to front to me. I was much tougher before school. I had learnt to love the outdoors and to understand the wild and how to push myself. When I hit school, suddenly all I felt was fear. Fear forces you to look tough on the outside, but makes you weak on the inside. And he goes on to say, the next page, conversely, those Sunday night drives back to school were truly torturous. Give me SAS selection any day. And that was bad, trust me. So, yeah, let's just kind of breathe that in. It's like, He preferred SAS selection day, which was pretty bad. So yeah, just some ideas really there. So has this changed? That would be the question. And, boarding schools have changed now. The food is much better. There is less bullying, but it still goes on. I work personally with people in their 20s, they left a few years ago from boarding school. It hasn't really changed that much. I spoke to Tuan Zopperman on my podcast episode about 25, I believe, who's a head teacher, works in South Africa, and he was on the senior management in a boarding school. And he said that a lot of the teachers nowadays are so busy, with paperwork, safeguarding, that they just don't have the time to spend with the children. So what happens is there is a lot of peer-on-peer bullying. And, there's a website called Everyone's Invited, and it shows there's still sexual abuse going on. And if you look at the names of the schools, it's most of the well-known schools in Britain where sexual abuse is going on. So has it changed? By all accounts, I don't know, but by all accounts, it hasn't really changed. For me, the emotional neglect still goes on. The physical neglect might be better, but emotionally, essentially your parents still aren't there. We need that. What happens is, when we go to boarding school, even nowadays, there's a break in attachment. You go age 8 or 11, you can't see your parents. I mean, what's securely attached? It means securely attached people typically grew up with plenty of love from consistently responsive caregivers. If your parents aren't there for 9 months of the year, that's not a typically responsive caregiver. So yeah, lots of ideas here, and I'm going to finish with Bruce Adamson. This is from a report recently, and he's the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland, and he's talking about care homes. And as Joy Schaverien points out in the book here, page 7, she says that care homes and boarding schools are very similar. And she says the definition of children in care seems to fit the child in boarding school. And what he says, Bruce Adamson, he says, placing a child in secure care is one of the most significant interferences with the child's rights that the state can make. The decision to take a child away from family and community and deprive them of their liberty must be done when it is in the child's best interest as a last resort and for the shortest period possible. And then he goes on to say, I warmly welcome the inclusion of data on distance that children are placed away from home. The significant distances that many children in secure settings are away from family and community has a huge impact on the respect for family life. Yeah, so many of my clients, their parents lived in Africa or Asia, and they were nowhere near the family. They lost everything when they went to boarding school. That huge break, that huge separation. So yeah, just some ideas and reflections here. This Friday, I've got a great podcast interview with Richard Grannon, who's one of the leading voices on YouTube, the author of The Cult of One, to talk about narcissism. He's also an ex-boarder, so that should be fascinating. And also this Saturday, I've got my boarding school workshop, which is boarding school trauma and recovery. I'll be going into a lot more depth about what I've talked about today. And then the second half of the afternoon will be about recovery. What do I teach clients? What have I worked on myself? And how do we recover from complex trauma, and especially boarding school syndrome? So I'll leave a link in the bottom below. But yeah, hope this is of help. Just some ideas here. So is boarding school child abuse? So I hope that's been of help.